Hello, and welcome to the first of 5 mini clips about ancient Greek history and ancient Greek civilization. In this clip, I will tell you all about the start of the polis and the function it had, and a little bit of Greek history timeline. So, first up, we're coming into a new era. This is the era of Greek and Romans. You see the symbol here, and these are the 5 distinctive characteristics that you need to remember and you need to understand and be able to recognize in sources and in questions and so on. And as you might see that there's 5 of them in era 2, 3 of them have more to do with the Romans, and these 2 are the ones being dealt with in the upcoming lessons about the Greeks and also in this little movie clip. So we're in the period of the antiquity, the era of the time of Greeks and Romans, and you see the dates 300 before Christ till 500 after. Well, you might wonder who this is, but the more perceptive you probably have recognized Homer Simpson from The Simpsons. And one of the reasons that so many people still remember the Greeks is because of Homer. However, it's of course not this Homer, but this Homer. Homer, the blind poet, allegedly the writer of the famous stories The Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad being about the Trojan War, and the Odyssey about the return of one of the heroes that had fought in the Trojan War, Odysseus. And it's because of these stories that we actually know so much about Greek ancient history, Greek culture, and the way that the Greek dealt with their culture and their stories. So today is the first time that we actually encounter the Greeks and what they have meant to, our history and the modern Western world. So why do we study the Greeks? Well, there's definitely more than one reason, but one of the reasons is because of their ancient culture, their temples, the famous city-states and the polis that they produced, but also because of the forms of government that they sort of started, that they maybe discovered or copied from other societies and civilizations. But the words that we use for our political systems are very often borrowed or go back to Greek ancient times. And here you see 4 forms of government. We'll get more into detail about the different forms, but it's important that you understand what they mean: monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, and democracy. And specifically, of course, the democracy of ancient Athens is very famous and is something we will be dealing with in the next lessons. However, let's start at the beginning. So you see all sorts of remains here, most of them from Athens, the famous Parthenon temple in Athens. But what actually is a polis? Well, here is the first distinctive characteristic. It's number 4, the development of scientific thinking and thinking about citizenship and politics in the Greek city-states. En in Dutch, de ontwikkeling van denken over politiek in de Griekse stadstaat. What did Greece look like? And maybe first a correction, we don't really talk about Greece in this era. The landscape of Greece, when we sort of look back from earlier civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Babylon, and so on, you see that the landscape of the Greeks is one with many inlets, mountains, hilly, hundreds of islands, all detached from one another. And in this map that you probably can recognize over here, there's all sorts of little cities emerging, all sorts of little city-states. And when you compare it for example, Egypt, which was one large state with one clear river that would overflow, that would flood, and all sorts of irrigation needed, Greece was totally different. There were maybe up to 150 independent cities, which are called city-states, and the Greek word for that is polis. So that's the singular word for it, one polis. And that is what a city-state would be. And what exactly is a polis, and it is a very important concept. It's the city with the surrounding area and most importantly the farmland or the sea or the fishing where the food would come from. So a polis is a separate state. It has its own government. It would have its own tradition, its own history, and so on. And each of these city-states, so you probably recognize Athens, and maybe somewhere in the south you see Sparta, and on the island of Crete you recognize Knossos, and so on. all these little city-states would have their own customs, their own traditions, and so on. And very famous examples are, of course, as I mentioned, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Mycenae, Argos, Olympia, Delos, etc. Lots of them, all with their own culture. So please remember that it's not right to talk about Greece. Most people living in Athens would say, I'm Athenian, I'm not a Greek. That's far later that people start to feel that way. So this geography of the area made it very hard to connect, and they shared language, so the famous Greek alphabet. If you take Greek as a subject, you might recognize it, or if you ever have taken Greek as a subject. And they shared the language with, of course, certain dialects and little sort of alterations in each city-state. The religion would be similar, and a common heritage, so they all would be in the same area, trade the same products, and so on. But it was also very common for a polis to have war with one another, so they would keep on bickering about food, about resources, about power, who would go where, and so on. And it was throughout history very common to have battles, major or minor ones, between polis. Okay, if we take a look at the ancient Greek timeline, we see that there's several sort of civilizations that have emerged over time. And our textbook sort of deals with them very specifically. We do it very swiftly. The most ancient sort of, earliest Greek civilization is actually the Minoan Civilization, which is on the island of Crete. They lived over there, the Minoans, and they developed a cultural form with, for example, the famous columns, which they largely borrowed from the Egyptians, by the way, but they gave their own twist to it. And they had a massive palace there, so Crete has been excavated many times to find remains of the Minoan civilization. And it's also the famous time of the myths of Minos and the Minotaurus. You might have heard of Minotaur, so half bull, half man, who protected the island. This is all from around this area, and we don't know that much about it. If we fast forward, we see that around 1400 BC, there's this civilization called the Mycenaeans, who control the Aegean Sea. So they are now the people in charge, doing all the trade in the Mediterranean Sea, specifically the Aegean Sea, and also developing their own culture. So, for example, this golden mask is very typical of the Mycenaeans. And these were both very civilized cultures, very focused on water, travel on land, trade, because resources were scarce very often, and all focused on the Aegean Sea. So you need to know and recognize them and put them in the right order, but we don't know that much about them, and we will skip to the Greek, what we call the Greek Dark Ages. And this is not really the best of terms. It sounds a bit negative, Dark Ages, but it's simple that from the time from around 1100 BC to 750 BC, we just don't have that much information compared to the time before that and also after 750 BC. So there's this sort of black time where we don't know much about, no primary texts, some archaeological evidence, and we see that small villages develop. This accidentally is the time of the Trojan War. So if the Trojan Wars ever took place, we're not really sure, but if they did, it must have been around this time. So the story about Helen who was sort of captured or took by a Trojan prince. All the Greek heroes sort of assembled and set sail for Troy, and then spent 10 years there to fight the city. Finally, Odysseus thought of the plan with the wooden horse, het houten paard in Dutch, you might have heard of it, and they finally captured the city, and then Odysseus had to be on his way back. This is all in the Dark Ages, and again, we're not sure whether or not this is a story entirely made up or if it actually happened. Lots of archaeologists actually went looking for Troy, and some actually have claimed that they'd found it. So when we continue our timeline, we see that the Archaic period is very well known, and this is the time when the Greek alphabet was created. It's sort of borrowed from the Phoenicians, another civilization in the Mediterranean, But this is where our Greek alphabet emerged. And it's an important one because lots of the Greek alphabet was copied or altered and turned into our Western alphabet. Many of the famous polis that we just discussed, so I mentioned a few, were founded in this time. So Athens, Sparta, and so on. All these others were sort of built up in the archaic period. And there was a huge growth in commerce, in trade, manufacturing, olive oil, but also things like, for example, making ships was a very specific commerce as well. And the population started growing. So most of these polis sort of came to face a difficulty that they had lots of food because of trade. They would trade with the Black Sea or with the south of Italy. And the population started growing. And of course, in the end, then you could have lead to all sorts of problems that when your population keeps growing, you will have a shortage of food. And specifically, Athens dealt with that in a way that they made colonies. And this is also the time when democracy was introduced in Athens, but we'll talk about that in the next clip. However, back to this problem of overpopulation or shortage of food, it's sort of the same problem, so to say. This was dealt with in different ways. And when these city-states start proper developing, you see that these city-states, again, are not only city but also separate independent state. They sort of developed in a similar way. So most of these city-states would have an Acropolis or an Acropolis in Dutch, which is literally the high city above. It would be fortified. People would go there in time of danger, and it would contain the most important buildings. So, for example, the temple, the marketplace, major governmental buildings, stuff like that. Famous important buildings would be in the Acropolis. You can see that in the picture there. And the Greeks would build temples for all of their different gods, which we will get to. Very often there also would be an agora, a square, where the citizens would do their business, discuss politics, trade, of course, and most of the citizens would at least visit the agora once a day just to keep up with things happening in the polis. And very importantly, most city-states were ruled by the nobility, so they were an oligarchy or an aristocracy. The people of noble heritage, they would be the ones in charge. So not one king, could also be in some city-states, and also not the people, democracy, that would come later. Well, one of the tricky things for Greece was 20% of the land was available for agriculture. So when the population started growing, again, there was this shortage of land. And the solution could be two things. So people started looking for new lands across the sea. If you had a strong naval connection, so you were very strong on water, such as Athens was, lots of people started settling. So they found colonies in France, Italy, Russia, Turkey, the Black Sea area. Very areas where you can grow a lot of food, very fertile. That's where these people would go. They would set up new little polis, and they would start a trade network all over the Mediterranean Sea. And this was specifically the way that Athens dealt with this problem. However, during this period, you would see that these people, traders, would be more and more powerful, would get more wealthy, and they started to demand their influence in the city. So there was this sort of rich layer of people in most cities that said, well, okay, we're not nobility, we were not born rich, but we became rich because of our trade. We also want to have a say in politics. And this is specifically the point where in one famous city-state, Athens, a new idea of politics starts emerging. You see the colonies again, very specifically in the south of Italy, as I mentioned, and the Black Sea and the borders of Turkey. However, what's very important, and that's sort of the cliffhanger to the next clip, the Athenian politician Clisthenes introduced a new form of government in 509 BC. That's a very important date because then sort of the first idea of democracy was founded in Athens. And we'll talk about that more in the next clip. For today, please remember what a polis is and the different sets, so how we know the Greeks and more about it in the next video. See you then. Bye bye.